Imagine turning on the evening news and seeing story after story about shootings, carjackings, and missing children. Even if you personally have never experienced a violent crime, after watching enough of these stories, the world can start to feel dangerous, almost threatening. You might become more cautious, more anxious, or even suspicious of others. This reaction is not accidental, though. As you see, mass media, particularly the television news, has a powerful influence on how people understand the world around them. One of the most significant ways mass media affects society is by shaping the way that we perceive risk, danger, and crime. Television news does not just report reality, it often constructs it in a way that increases public fear and distorts how common crime actually is. Television news is designed to capture attention. Producers have to compete with hundreds of channels and online platforms so that stories that involve danger, violence, or tragedy are more likely to be selected as leading headlines. As a result, viewers are repeatedly exposed to the most extreme and emotional events. According to George Gerbner's cultivation theory, heavy exposure to television gradually shapes people's beliefs about reality. Gerbner and his colleagues argued that long term viewing leads audiences to adopt a television version of reality, which is often much more violent and threatening than real life. In other words, if crime dominates the news, people begin to believe that crime dominates their communities. Gerbner's research found that heavy television viewers were more likely to believe that crime rates were increasing and that they were personally in danger, even when actual crime statistics did not support those fears. This phenomenon is also often referred to as the mean world syndrome, which is where individuals come to view the world as more dangerous than it really is. According to Gerbner, Gross, Morgan, and Signorelli in 1986, viewers who consume large amounts of television are more likely to assume that violence is common and that people are generally untrustworthy. This distorted perception can have serious consequences. When people believe the world is more dangerous than it truly is, they may avoid public places, fear strangers, or support harsher criminal justice policies. Fear becomes a social emotion that spreads not through personal experience, but through media exposure. Television news, through repetition and dramatic storytelling, slowly cultivates anxiety and mistrust. Another important concept related to television news and fear is agenda setting theory. Agenda setting suggests that the media may not tell us what to think, but it tells us what to think about. When television news emphasizes crime stories night after night, crime becomes one of the most important issues in the public's mind, even if it's not statistically the most urgent problem in society today. According to McCombs and Shaw, 1972, mass media influences which topics people believe are significant by giving them repeated attention. If viewers constantly see stories about shootings or attacks, they may believe that crime is the number one threat to society, even when research shows that issues like healthcare, housing, or education are often more pressing. Television news takes isolated events and turns them into dominant narratives, which then shapes public opinion. In addition to agenda setting, television news often relies on framing, which influences how stories are interpreted. Framing refers to the way that information is presented. News anchors may use language that emphasizes danger, urgency, and fear. Background music, dramatic language, and emotional interviews all contribute to how viewers feel about the story. This emotional framing makes crime seem closer, more personal, and more threatening than it actually is usually. Another major issue is that crime coverage is frequently not proportional to real world crime rates. Some types of crime receive far more coverage than others. For example, violent crimes are often shown more than white collar crimes, even though financial crimes affect more people economically. According to research by the Pew Research Center in 2010, television news heavily overrepresents violent crime compared to how often it actually occurs. This means that viewers are receiving a biased reality without even realizing it. The repetitive focus on violence can also influence how certain groups are viewed by people. Television news sometimes reinforces racial and social stereotypes by disproportionately featuring certain groups as criminals. This creates fear of not just crime, but people. When media repeatedly presents one group as dangerous, viewers may subconsciously associate that group with crime, even if there is no factual basis for doing so. According to Dixon and Lenz in 2000, local television news often overrepresents black individuals as crime suspects and underrepresents them as victims or professionals. Over time, these portrayals shape attitudes and reinforce harmful stereotypes. This kind of representation does not just affect individual opinions, it affects how entire communities interact and how public policies are formed. Beyond fear and stereotypes, media driven anxiety can also lead to psychological stress. When people constantly consume negative news stories, they may experience negative emotional fatigue, anxiety, or helplessness. Even when no immediate threat exists, the emotional impact of constant exposure to tragedy can leave viewers feeling controlled by fear rather than informed by facts. This connects to what Williams said in 2009, describes as the persuasive power of mass communication. Media does not always persuade through argument, it persuades through repetition, imagery, and emotion. Over time, viewers do not just consume media, they absorb it into their worldview. Television becomes less of a window into reality and more of a mirror that reflects back into the audience. However, this does not mean that television news is inherently bad. News is necessary for an informed society. The problem is not that crime is reported, but that it is heavily emphasized without context. A balanced news approach would include more long term issues, solutions, and perspectives instead of only focusing on the most dramatic events. When audiences understand that crime stories represent exceptions rather than the norm, fear becomes less controlling and more manageable. In conclusion, one of the most important ways that mass media affects society is by shaping how people perceive crime and danger. Through cultivation, agenda setting, and framing, television news creates an emotional reality that often feels more frightening than actual life. Viewers begin to believe that the world is more dangerous than it really is, which affects their behavior, their trust in others, and their support for social policies. While news is essential, it must be consumed critically. When people understand how television news operates, they gain power over how it shapes their beliefs. Instead of allowing fear to dictate reality, viewers can learn to separate dramatic storytelling from factual truth, and in doing so, reclaim a more accurate view of the real world.